ahead and get started. Thank you so much for being here today. My name is Corey Woodley. I'm chairwoman of Pullman Police Advisory, and today will be my last day in that role, but really happy to be here. We're actually just going to go ahead and get started with attendance. So we'll just start by going around and do a quick roll call on attendance. So please start, David.
So David Makin, it's a multicultural alternate.
Okay. Richard.
Richard Hume, Pioneer Hill.
Oh, okay. Yeah.
Jaya Sivakumar, Military Hill.
Okay.
Angie Center, WCU Faculty Staff Alternate.
Kaneen Shakini, Primary Black Faculty Staff Association.
Phyllis Stolkop, Sunnyside Hill.
Oh, Corey with the business.
Eric Tesoff, Business.
Barbara Hammond, College Hill.
Adam Williams, Sunnyside Alternate.
Gary Jenkins, Pullman Police Chief.
Darby Baldwin, the Assistant to the Police Chief.
Great. Thank you so much. Did everyone get a chance to look at the April 8th, 2019 meeting minutes? They were not printed, but I did look at them and they looked good to me. So
I move approval of the minutes.
Second. All in favor? Aye. Any opposed? Okay, appreciate that. Thank you, Darby. We're going to get right into our presentation today. So really excited about this. This is something we've been talking about for a while, hearing more about marijuana research and things going on at the university in relation to that. So we actually get to hear from one of our own today. Really excited about that, as well as, did you want to introduce the other guest?
So I said I could sit here, but it seems odd to sit. So this is Dr. Willits, and he's also on the project. We were hoping to just give you an overview of kind of the research we've been doing, and then talk a little bit more about conversation and questions that you have, since we've spent the last several years studying legalization. So this is part of a 3-year project that we obtained from the National Institute of Justice. So Mary Story is the PI, and then there's a list of all the doctoral students that also assisted. I think it's really important to highlight the just tremendous work that our graduate students and undergraduate students have done, working alongside all of the faculty. So just kind of very briefly, we have a variety of state partners. This was a rather large component of the grant, was that what was unique about what we were trying to do was, instead of just kind of looking at the data, we really wanted to get out there and talk to cops. So it's one thing to just look at, crime reports that our agencies are providing, but it's entirely something different when you take the time to speak with all of the agencies. And so you'll see that we've been able to interview over 150 officers across the state at both the local level, tribal, rural, suburban. It really has been actually a remarkable experience to be able to hear what these stakeholders are really sharing with us. It's just kind of just a snapshot of the different partners that we've had, as well as you can see Pullman Police Department, WSU, PD. We were also able to talk to officers along the border, so particularly in Moscow and then of course the Lewiston, Clarkston area. We have really kind of 2 different approaches, and so I'll give a little bit of background in terms of what we've done, and then I'll turn it over to Dr. Willits to kind of walk you through some of the different analyses that we published from and what we're anticipating publishing over the next few months. So our quantitative analysis really is thinking about it from kind of a time series approach, which is looking at, over this long period of time, we've had agencies reporting different crime, certainly breaking down those different types, so thinking about how burglary might have been impacted, thinking about how calls for service, in terms of thinking about what police resources are like. So this is kind of what those time series analysis have allowed us to do, which is really think about what happens the very moment you legalize, and then thinking about also what happens when you have recreational sales, right? So it's one thing when you legalize, how that might have an impact. But some would argue it's actually more important when you think about when you actually can go into a store, a dispensary, and actually purchase a product. We've also looked at traffic safety data, and so Dr. Wilt will be able to really kind of walk you through some of those results as well. And then again, we've had interviews and focus groups, again, over 150 individuals that we've been able to sit down and really listen to what their fears were, their worries, what they're seeing in a legalized environment, and they are very lengthy You can imagine that some of our interviews run well over an hour, hour and a half, sometimes 2 hours, just kind of listening to the different stakeholders. We've also been looking at camera footage, so this is thinking primarily at in-car body-worn camera footage as it relates to field sobriety tests. So seeing how officers approach those, because this is very different. This is, they dealt with intoxication, but how do you handle what is an influx of cases in which people are polydrug users, so that means they're under the influence of alcohol and other drugs, or when it's just marijuana alone. So if you think about how this was kind of pitched to voters, it really came down to, what this will do, and you'll see, is it'll increase state revenues but reduce crime. When you look at all of the states where legalization has been approved, every single one of them talks about public safety benefits. Right, so it's not just the state will have an opportunity to obtain more revenue, it's that we'll see a reduction in crime, we'll see an improvement in police resources. And so what we really wanted to think about is, well, can we measure those and where are some of the best places to start? But on the other side, you had opponents who were very vocal in that you are going to get more intoxication, more accidents, that you're going to get greater use by juveniles, and that a range of crimes would potentially increase. And kind of rather fascinating is that we're pretty inconsistent. When you look across the research, you see areas where the proponents are entirely accurate and others where the opponents, it holds true. So what we've really done, and we can answer some questions a little bit later, is around what happens when you look at specific communities as opposed to thinking about the entire state. What happens when you really narrow that down? So with that said, I'll turn this over to Dr. Willits, who will dive into some of our studies.
Okay, so one of the things that we wanted to do when we did this study was to really make sure that we were providing a solid basis and evidence to discuss marijuana policy. It's, at this point, the country seems to be shifting more and more towards legalization. Now, there's been some recent hiccups in New York and so forth in terms of whether those laws can pass. But I think, what are we up to now? Something like 10 states in D.C. that have recreational laws, and over 30 states have some sort of medicinal law allowing access. A lot of the arguments around legalization, though, are based in anecdotes. They're sound bites. And so we have some of them listed up here. So then, I guess we should update, no longer current, but then Attorney General Jeff Sessions was noting that there really is this increase in violence that he was seeing, but of course there weren't any sources, and we wanted to know, where did that data come from? Where did we see this violence pop up? We also see local papers in both Colorado and Washington sort of sounding the alarm bell that legalization has had all of these positive or negative effects. And we were, wanting to dive into that and look at the data at hand to see to what extent that was true. Here are some of these points of evidence that have been put out there. So these are bad data points. I will start off by saying these are some of the things we were trying to combat. So you have this chart on the left that shows the sort of total crimes and property crimes in Seattle. And if you look at it, you're like, oh, legalization happens in 2012, its sales starts in 2014, there's been this increase. And that was actually one of the arguments, is that in this particular news article, is that if you look at this chart, there's clearly an increase. That circle there around the 35,000, it's really disingenuous to start your bar chart at 35,000. Because you can imagine if you zoomed out at this, that's actually not all that much higher at all. Yeah. Same thing on the right. Started the bar chart off again at 800 for the state of Colorado, which again makes increases or decreases look much more substantial than they are. Some other folks, and we've worked with them quite a bit, the Northwest HIDA, so the High Intensity Drug Traffic Agency for this region, have also found evidence that marijuana legalization has resulted in certain increases and in some cases decreases in crime. But one of the things that people really didn't do effectively was control for prior trends. If legalization, or let me rephrase that, if violent crime was already going up or down, and then legalization happened, you want to make sure you're accounting for the direction it was already going before making a big claim about, oh, here's what happened to public So that's what we're working towards. I'll skip through some of this to get to our data, and I think more time for Q&A is better than more time for me talking. So what we did was a method called interrupted time series analysis, and I've been spending probably more time than I ever expected teaching graduate students interrupted time series analysis the last 2.5 years of this project, but it makes a lot of sense. So it's a method that's typically used by epidemiologists and public health people to say, oh, we banned smoking in public spaces in California, what was the effect on cancer rates, or whatever the case may be. And in our context, we're thinking of legalization as the treatment, which sounds funny, but treatment only in the sense of it was banned, now it's legalized. What happened before and after? We gathered data from 17, it's actually updated now through 2017, I think. So 18 years of data. And we also looked at medicalization laws, but for the analysis that we're presenting in this PowerPoint, our interruption points were really just when did we legalize, and we contextualize that as December of 2012. There's a little bit of debate about when that actually went into effect. I think officially it was December 6th for Washington. I'm not sure about Colorado off the top of my head. But then we also have this second interruption point, because as David said, making it legal to possess marijuana is one thing, but establishing a store where people can purchase it is another thing. That's when maybe you would expect to see this increase in sort of market size and accessibility. And so we add a second interruption point there. And all the interruption points do is they sort of say, okay, prior to the interruption point, what was the trend? What happened at the interruption point? What happened after it? So these models, our former graduate student, now faculty colleague at Stockton University, Robin Liu, helped me create these. And what you see in Colorado is, I should not push buttons. You see that in Colorado, you see these two lines, the solid line and the dashed line. The solid line is our control group. That's all the states that had no marijuana laws whatsoever. And then the dashed line, the sort of lighter line, is Colorado. The same thing on the right you're seeing, but for property crime. And so you can see that over time, we still were in that tail end of crime rates going down following the late 90s through the 2000s. We jump up to about 2012, and at this point, it's flat for the control group. It goes down a little bit for Colorado, and then it goes up. And there is this increase in crime in Colorado. It is going up, but so is the rest of the country, which makes the argument that it was legalization a little weaker. So that's one of those things those prior charts weren't showing you. They were just showing you, here's what's happening in Colorado. But actually that increase that we're seeing for violent crime seems to be happening elsewhere. We see the same sort of thing for property crime, except we do have this 1 point of increase. And in fact, as far as negative effects on crime, probably the only one that I have any confidence in, and this is only in certain cases, is it may be the case that legalization has increased larceny. I haven't seen any other evidence in any of our analysis for anything else. And I say may be the case because this isn't a true experiment, right? It's real life data, it's observational, it has all those limitations. In Washington, the same basic picture, right? Violent crime has not gone up despite some of the alarm bells that folks are ringing. And in fact, if you look at certain types of violent crime, we have a paper that's under review now for assault in Washington, but not in Colorado. There's actually evidence that assault's gone down since legalization. How much of that's a real decrease and how much of that's just because assault's gone up in the rest of the country is a little bit up for debate, and we can talk about that. Property crime, again, you see that 1 point increase at the time of legalization, but no significant change over time. So there are people that have sent me some really unpleasant emails, and I also found out that they said a lot of not nice things about us on Twitter. But the evidence right now says that to whatever effect marijuana legalization has had on crime, it's modest. It's not causing the sky to fall. We're not seeing this giant increase in crime. We're also not seeing this giant decrease that some of the proponents said. This idea that, people, and the arguments were always a little far-fetched, right? Some of the arguments were, if you legalize crime, then the gangs and the traffickers who are selling it will go out of business. I mean, they weren't making most of their money on marijuana anyway. They were selling other things. Some of the other arguments were more pharmacological, right? Like people that are high don't commit crimes. It's not that many people out there that were committing crimes and that now are like, well, I was going to rob someone, but I'm high today. So we haven't seen a big increase or decrease. It's mostly a null result. And if you are invested in the science literature, it's incredibly hard to get null results published. People don't care when you don't find anything. We haven't found anything, and we're working on getting it published. It's an ongoing struggle. So this is some of the summary. We can talk about it more later, but this is diving into other types of crimes. So we saw some evidence that burglary rates were going down since legalization in Washington. I wouldn't say that marijuana has caused burglary to go down. I would just say legalization didn't have any real effect on burglary, and probably something else caused that to go down. Possibly the fact that Washington has historically had a high property crime rate, so it's easier to go down. Some of the other findings. Clearance rates. Are there clearance rates graphs in here?
There is.
Okay. So clearance rates. Clearance rates, there's a lot of ways to interpret a clearance rate. For our purposes, so when a crime is cleared, that means it's removed from this FBI's roster of founded cases and moved into solved cases, whether it be by an arrest being made, a person dying, some sort of exceptional circumstance. We were looking specifically just at clearance rates in the context of arrests. This is a resource allocation argument. So the idea being, the proponents would say, well, police officers are spending a disproportionate amount of their time policing minor drug offenses related to marijuana. So if we legalize marijuana, they'll be able to spend more time tracking down robbers and burglars and rapists and murderers. We looked at that, and this is actually the first paper we published. We sent that out 2 years ago. 2 years ago. And what we found is that, in general, legalization seems to have increased clearance rates modestly for certain crimes in Washington. The results are stronger in Colorado, and I think we have a chart for that. But this is a chart of Washington versus the U.S. average. If any of you are statistics people, you're saying, well, you didn't account for the cyclical variation. We did, we just didn't want to put it in to make the picture messy.
They don't look well at all. Cool.
Yeah, they look terrible when you put the thing in. But it does go up and down. But what you can see is that from January 2010 through legalization, clearance rates for burglary were going down in Washington. That is, the police were solving fewer burglaries per month over time. It was just, they weren't doing as well as they were after, right? After the line shoots up. So that's that increase. And that increase was slightly larger than the increase we saw for the control group. I wish we had the auto theft. The auto theft for Colorado is even more stark. For whatever reason, and I'm happy to brainstorm about it, clearance rates for auto theft in Colorado shot up following legalization. So in other words, once marijuana was legalized, police officers and police departments in Colorado were clearing auto theft cases at a much higher rate than they were before. Our last bit of research is stuff that's ongoing. And I wanted to talk about this partially because it's what I'm wrapping my mind around now. One of my graduate students keeps giving me more and more data, and we keep trying to figure out how to manage it. Today she walked into my office with 500 models. I don't know what to do with that. People have argued strongly that the biggest consequence of the war on drugs was that it was really a war on poor people and a war on minorities, right? That if you look at the war on drugs and you look at imprisonment rates, incarceration rates, you look at arrest rates, that poor people and people of color, especially African Americans in this country, were disproportionately arrested for these offenses. And so if we legalize marijuana, that'll help alleviate the disproportionality that's inherent in the system. These are some basic data. I have better data now, but some basic data that we put together for Washington. So here you see marijuana possession and sales arrest rates. So the top possession, the bottom arrest rates. I must have been in a very WSU mood because I put the two races in crimson and gray. So the white arrest rates are in gray, the African American arrest rates are in red or crimson. And you can see that there was, in fact, a large disparity prior to legalization, right? African Americans were being arrested at nearly 500 per 100,000 people for possession in 2009 versus whites who were arrested at under 200 per. And you can see in 2009 the arrest rates for blacks in this state was almost 3 times greater than for whites. Same thing for sales, it was about 3 times greater. I have to pitch this next part carefully. Possession and sales arrest rates for white and black offenders went down. They did, right? Like you look at the chart, it went down. And in that regard, it's a win in that you're seeing fewer people of both races being arrested and charged for these offenses. But the gains were disproportionately made by white offenders if you take this data seriously, right? So by 2015, for possession, it's 2.3, so it's about the same. But for sales, the disproportionality exists such that by 2015, African Americans were 7 times more likely to be arrested for marijuana sales, illicit marijuana sales, than whites. Now, it's still, African American sales rates are still lower than they were in 2009. So I don't want to make the argument, I don't want it to make it sound like legalization happened and it was worse for African Americans. My argument instead is legalization was good for everyone in terms of their arrest rates, if we consider that good. If you don't, then it's all bad, right? But if you consider this good, it was overall good. But white populations benefited proportionally more by arrest in terms of that, these data. We are drilling down into this, and I hope to have stuff ready for dissemination by the end of the summer. Some other folks that are doing work in this area, so Pearson and his colleagues are at Stanford, part of the Open Data Policing Initiative. I got that backwards.
Open Data Initiative?
Open Data Initiative. I don't know, they have data from a bunch of police departments that have made their data available, some willingly, some through Freedom of Information Request Acts. And they looked at traffic stops and they found a lot of the same thing, that if you look at legalization, that dashed line for Colorado and Washington, yeah, people were searched at lower rates following legalization because then the smell of marijuana was no longer necessarily entry into the car to search. But the disproportionality by race still is there following that work. So, our work out here isn't sort of on an island. There's other people finding the same sort of thing. And I think as far as that goes, my only point really is that legalization was never going to be this cure-all for racial disparities in the system. People made it out to be a cure-all, but those problems are much more deeply rooted than a single law or policy. We have our own data on jails, and this paper was published in the Prison Journal looking at jail booking rates in Washington by race, and again, yes, African Americans disproportionately represent the jail population in the state. So these are jail rates per 100,000. It doesn't mean that there are more African Americans in jails in Washington, right? Washington is predominantly a white state. It means by the number of African Americans in the community, they are disproportionately incarcerated. But legalization didn't seem to change that. So more sort of evidence in that same front. Okay, the other stuff that we are doing is calls for service and body-worn camera work. The body-worn camera work is not really ready to talk about. Calls for service, I'll pass and you can talk about it later if folks are interested. There are interesting results. So one of the things we started thinking about was that, crime and crime clearance, they're important, but that's not all that goes into policing. And in fact, a lot of calls go to the police where no one is arrested, there's no crime charged. But you could imagine after legalization, maybe people were calling the police saying, my neighbor's outside smoking marijuana or whatever it was. And so we wanted to look a little bit about that. We also have some work on cannabis impairment that I'm happy to talk about. That work's a little harder for people to hear about too, but cannabis plus alcohol, really bad for driving. Alcohol, just as bad still. Cannabis itself doesn't seem to be as bad as alcohol. Not saying we should legalize it, but we haven't seen a substantial increase in traffic accidents as a result of cannabis. And then black market persistence, that was a project we were working on. I think that realistically the state is going to do that project now through funding from the Washington State Patrol, so we're not as involved. But what we hear from a lot of our interviews is that the black market's still strong. The black market and now the gray market, the so-called gray market of diversion products. So one of our grad students, Dwayne Stanton, who's a former police commander from Oregon, did a lot of work with qualitatively, quantitatively, and he heard reports of people from a community purchasing large amounts of marijuana in Washington and driving east and being able to sell it for 600% markup. So sort of interesting diversion there and something we're still thinking about. Okay, so that's an overview of some of our stuff. We have a lot of other things we're working on, but we didn't put it all in there.
We want to keep this somewhat compact, but so the calls for service is kind of interesting. One the chief had asked us to look into, and so we actually compared Moscow and Pullman. And so once you have recreational sales, again controlling for Moscow and what their rates are, the chief's officers are handling about 6 more calls per month on average. Now they're illegal, so they're actually legalization. Let's say recreational sales seems to have actually impacted.
It's 6 per month, but that means over, it's not like it goes away. So by the time the year passed, that's another 70 calls over the year that have, each month gets compounded.
So that additional calls in Washington, or in Pullman?
In Pullman.
Okay.
And so we're doing the same so that's part of the work that we're trying to manage now is really is taken out of that state context. Like when you just look at Washington or Colorado, you see a lot of these nulls where there's nothing that happened. But when you actually drill down to the specific communities, you can find a really nice comparison, which is what Moscow does provide us. And certainly Lewiston, Clarkston, that kind of dichotomy as well. Then you can really start to see how it has an impact on the people who do this work down to that level. And you also see changes for specific call types, which was rather interesting. So we have those disaggregated. We haven't published it, so we didn't want to bring it in and get it on camera with all the, but once it is, then of course we'll be able to kind of walk you through what those specific calls look like. But I can say they are all call types that you would suspect to be associated with what would happen if you legalized or you had recreational sales of marijuana.
Are there comparable, I guess, border cities in Colorado? The only ones I can think of is Fort Collins and Wyoming, but not nearly as close.
Yeah, and the other part is that calls for service data, those are hard to get a hold of. So we can get a hold of crime data through NIBRS or the UCR, but calls for service, you have to actually ask the agencies for that, and they have to be willing to share. So for us, we actually were pretty fortunate that the agencies were signed on to do that heavy lifting to give us access to all the calls for service data.
We haven't really looked at Colorado yet. It's one of those things, we have some colleagues that are out there doing some work, so maybe if they have the right ties. We've had a lot better luck with Washington and Idaho data though.
We also have a unique position where not all counties approved recreational sale. So we're trying to think more spatially about within the county levels, kind of seeing what happens when you have approval of recreational sales, or what we would call like the saturation of the market, just how dense is that seed to sale system within a given area, and how does that have an impact, not on just crimes, but really thinking about calls for service. Just imagine if the dispensaries are being burglarized or robbed. We certainly want to know that specific area, which on a whole may not show a change if you're looking at it in aggregate form. If you can narrow down to a specific address where you know a dispensary is at, you can start to look at it that way.
How do you guys, and how often do you deal with the public misunderstanding data and misunderstanding correlation and causation and what it means? And how do you use what you guys do in order to make an influence to improve the public's understanding of such data especially in a world right now where the media oftentimes mixes up and misunderstands data and publishes and interprets their own meaning from that data.
Yeah, I think the Twitter quote was pretty apt, we do a lot of interviews, but I think you've probably done the most communication in trying to explain to people, particularly our crime. So when the clearance rates came out, I did a lot of interviews, Como News, and lots of places, but I think we had more resistance to the crime. The clearance, they were kind of like, okay, that makes sense. But people, that cognitive dissonance that we saw with the crime data.
So, it's a really great question. It's something we struggle with, honestly, in the sense that we want to get our work out there in a way that's accessible. It's federally funded, so this is really the country's work, right? Like, the National Institute of Justice paid us to do it. We're doing the work. But we also want to make sure that it's out there in the right scientific outlets. So with the clearance rate paper, for instance, it got posted to Reddit. And that was one of the ways we disseminated it. And it was viewed by over 1 million people and had something like 100,000 likes on Reddit. And it was widely picked up. But again, if you read it through the comments, a lot of them were saying stuff like, well, now you're going to tell me water is wet. And, like, of course, police, when they don't have to do this, they'll do better in other areas. The crime one, we started off actually by writing an op-ed in the Seattle Times. And that's, just it was a sort of gentle nudging. So one of the biggest issues, and I'm sure that some of you have heard this as well, is that we've generated a lot of revenue by legalizing cannabis. That revenue has not, recording, I'll be careful, but has not necessarily gone where they said it would go. We were fortunate that our funding came from the federal government. So we weren't reliant on it, but we have colleagues in psychology, we have colleagues in economics, colleagues in business, colleagues in law schools, all across the state who have really sort of important questions regarding cannabis, and of course all the medical folks, that they're not able to get the money because, the state has given less than 1/10 of the revenue allocated to research that they said they would give. And so I wrote this op-ed that challenged a book. So there's a book that says, here's all the reasons why marijuana is long-term bad, and they presented a lot of data, some of it from Washington, saying, look, it increases homicide rates, it increases all of this. And then we sort of said, actually, if you count for pre-existing trends, it doesn't really do anything in Washington. And then the author of that book went on like a 9-rant tweet. I don't know what you call it when you tweet repeatedly, explaining exactly why I was a really bad person who was apparently a shill for the marijuana market. I'm like, actually, I'm a shill for the DOJ. Never mind. But we've been trying to do that. We've been trying to hit popular press journals, internet sites. We just submitted another grant recently where one of the things we want to do is make a website available to the public that shows some of these rates and trends for this and other things at the sort of state and sub-state level that people could go learn about on their own. But my concern is that people will find their data, cherry pick it, and then interpret it how they want. And that book that really we wrote the op-ed in response to, that's what they did. They did the correlations, causation argument. They said, oh, look, since legalization, this crime rate for this type of place in Washington was this much higher. And I'm like, well, but what about the trend it was already going in? So I think it's our perpetual struggle is how to get this out in a way that's responsible and still interesting to people, because if you go too technical, people just stop listening.
I think it's also a funny thing to say for future conversations. So if they say, oh, it's because marijuana was legalized this year, you could also say, yeah, but they also approved this fertilizer on a farm that was 5 doors down, and they also, decided that they were going to put reclamated water into our aquifer system. Or you can go on to you can say a million other things that happened in that same year.
Yep.
That could have so many ridiculous effects in order to help teach this correlation causation flaw. And I think it's something that's really a struggle in all fields. I'm in the water sciences and I teach about water.
Yeah.
And it's really difficult how people don't realize that a lot of the data can be looking like it says one thing, but it's really saying another, and why it's important to have experts who can help people interpret what's actually going on.
Yeah, there's a lot of confirmation bias going on with marijuana, right? They find the evidence they want, and then it's, but look, there's a trend. Yeah, we saw it with Seattle, right? Like, we see calls for service in Seattle going a specific direction. How do you disentangle calls for service in Seattle, the effects of legalization, with the effects of having a new chief, with the effects of everything else that's going on in that city? That's a tough sell.
Thank you. What other questions?
How did you deal with poly drug use in your statistics? So if somebody's arrested and they're under the influence of alcohol and cannabis, where does that fall in your statistical analysis?
So that's a really good question. So most of our crime data really doesn't have to have impairment, right? It's just were they arrested for possession or sales of marijuana. So in that case, it was pretty straightforward. For the traffic data, so Washington is one of the best states in the country for collecting data on what happens in traffic incidents. In fact, as of right now, Oregon and Alaska both send their toxicology lab requests to our state, which makes our toxicology labs slow, but they're really good and they have a nice method. It's outside of my field for parsing out the active and inactive ingredients in cannabis. And so for the traffic stuff, we were actually able to look at groups of alcohol and cannabis, cannabis alone, alcohol alone, clean drivers. So it kind of depended on the study. So in some cases we didn't worry about it because we were just wondering what they were arrested for. If it was the sort of more impairment-based stuff, we tried our best to look at poly drug use too. And like I said, poly drug use did, for traffic safety, it was a pretty big risk factor for having driving errors and fatal accidents.
So the other part of that for the body-worn camera data is we're looking at not just how a field sobriety test takes place, but we had chiefs that were interested and wanted to know how much time are their officers spending on those. So that's what we've been really looking at is what are the best practices for how do you handle potential or detect impairment, and then getting insight from the officers, those enforcement officers that are out there trying to identify impairment, what are the best processes. So that was really allowed us to measure time on scene, just how much time they're actually spending with a person, as well as what are the best practices for if you're going to detect impairment. For example, a very straightforward one is where do you mount the camera on the officer? Because when you talk to field sobriety, officers doing field sobriety tests, they tell you the same thing. Like, I want to see their eyes, I want to be able to document that. But if an agency is, for example, a chest mount only agency and they don't allow their officers to change that position, then that doesn't work for them. And so this is part of kind of that due diligence and getting out there to talk to officers, is that you can then give recommendations back. One of our primary recommendations, at least as it relates to body-worn cameras and field sobriety tests, is that you have to allow those officers to wear the camera in the position that will give them the best evidentiary value.
And it's not directly related to the question, but this is actually one of the biggest puzzles we still face, is that our clearance rate data suggests that police effectiveness, if clearance rate's a measure of effectiveness, I don't know if it is, but if it is, police have become more effective and better developing resource plans since legalization, yet the officers we interviewed and did focus groups with, not all of them, but especially those that are heavily involved in traffic, have told us that cannabis is taking up a ton of their time for these stops. So it's sort of like, how can it both be freeing up time, and yet these officers are telling us a cannabis stop is a shift-ending 6-hour stop, waiting for a DRE to come from somewhere to do a sobriety test, or waiting for a warrant for a blood draw. Whereas the alcohol was always fairly, it's still a long call, but fairly easy in comparison.
It's interesting because you have so many states coming on or legalizing it at different time intervals that you could potentially, you probably are, continuing your research and your data with different states and seeing what their results are, if there's comparables or if your data repeats or not.
That's what we'd love to do that if we can track down the right data. We've had great luck in Washington. I mean, luck's not the right word, but we have a lot of support from different agencies in Washington and Idaho. Not all of this data is easily accessible elsewhere, though.
This was a very good presentation,
thank you.
and the governor is just is pardoning what people that have just been arrested on marijuana. I think it says something like 45,000 people, but I think we've gone beyond marijuana now. I think the opioid crisis is just, that kills people. It's just terrible.
And that's one of the things we want to look at too.
I think you've got a whole new research field.
Yeah. One of the arguments that people made with medical states, and whether it's true or not, I have trouble accepting some of the state level arguments, even our own, because again, you're talking about an entire state, and that's tricky, right? But one of the first arguments people made is that states with medical marijuana laws suffered less from the opioid crisis because people would self-medicate or use marijuana instead of opioids. Love to know and get the data to see whether that's true.
If that's true, I'm all for marijuana.
That's right. I don't feel comfortable enough saying that they're right. I'd love to know though.
Thinking about, we talk about the money, and we're starting to get data in on that, but that's where it starts to get, some would argue, rather important to kind of disentangle, which is if we're generating all these revenues, and we have this tax revenue that are going to counties, right, from retail sales, from the business side, what are we actually doing with that? So this idea is that you're supposed to use these funds to then improve public health, public education, public safety. We should be able to see the tangible benefits of that. And then thus far, what we haven't been able to link is that regulatory data with changes. I mean, it's hard to identify where those funds specifically went to hire 4 officers or hire 2 more mental health clinicians. But I think when you can look at it in its aggregate form, we should be able to see benefits. So that's a part of the research that Dale and I are trying to continue to do, is to actually merge that regulatory data on taxation and revenue, and to actually see how our community is actually bettered by this. It's not just having a business, but it's you have these businesses that generate these revenues. What are communities actually doing with that? And right now, that's kind of that missing link, because the state was only, by law, required to allocate it for a certain period of time.
I think it's not even, I think it's just standing state law in Washington is they have to follow the advisory for 2 years on the budget, and then after that they can reallocate. So, yeah. And of course, the first 2 years of legalization, there was no revenue. The sales didn't start until 2014. So,
Colorado's law is a little bit different. Don't they dictate, or isn't it a little permanent, that how the revenues split up?
I don't know, to be honest. So, yeah, Nick Loveridge would know that too.
Because that would be an interesting difference too.
Yeah, and we're finding like increasingly different. Like Colorado and Washington, they did not do it the same, and the effects are starting to show up in the data. For instance, for as bad as that slide I showed you on race was for Washington, it's substantially worse in Colorado. The disparities. We have some models that show no significant decrease in arrest rates for African Americans. It's absurd to legalize a substance but not decrease the amount of people arrested for it. For whatever reason, and I'm not a Colorado expert, the Colorado effect has been worse for people of color. One of our grad students came by, we were looking at juvenile things, because that's one of the other concerns, right? Is it a problem for juveniles? And to the extent that there are problems, it seems like those problems are happening more in Colorado than Washington again. And it's trying to pierce the sort of layer of how much of that is just the difference in Colorado and Washington, and how much of that's a difference in how we implemented the laws in these 2 states. And that's where, not being a political scientist, I find myself limited.
I would say that in talking to our officers and our focus groups and interviews, and you have agencies, chiefs that will tell you they did not get resources. Like one of the quotes is like, I never got a check to hire a new officer, right? Like I'm supposed to get money to do this thing, and it never really materialized. So you can imagine if it's pitched around public safety and the benefits, they're supposed to come with it, and agencies are going, I didn't get any more money to actually hire someone. Right? We need more school resource officers. We didn't get a budget for that. We didn't, like, and I can understand how frustrating that would be if you're expecting to get just enough money, but it never actually comes.
Yeah, even in Spokane, there was an article in the paper up there where they suggested that this new hire, they were getting this one hire, and that it was from the marijuana funds, but when we talked to the folks in the Spokane Police Department, they were like, kind of, but also from some other things. The article also suggested that most of the money was going to the University of Washington and Washington State University, and I can assure you that's not true.
None of that.
No, we definitely.
Any other questions? Well, thank you so much. That was a great presentation. That's been something we've been looking forward to hearing about for a while. Thank you both.
You're welcome. If you all have any questions that you would like to know with Pullman's data or Pullman versus Moscow, please send our way. I mean, I think we're always interested in working on things that are relevant to the community.
And frankly, it's part of our job. We get a portion of our salary is dedicated to sort of service type projects.
Thank you. Okay, so I'm going to pass it off to Eric to talk about our proposed changes to our police advisory guidelines.
So I'm going to just start by talking about what we have now, and as far as the changes are concerned. So we have a set up for each of our constituencies. We have what we call a primary representative and alternate representative. The main difference being that the primary, whenever they're in the meeting, has the ability to vote. The alternate does not have the ability to vote when the primary is present. The goal of the revision is to simply do away with the primary alternate designation and simply have 2 representatives per constituency, up to obviously if they're filled, and both representatives would have voting rights when they are present in the meeting. That's a summary of what the changes entail. If you look through the printout, basically everything in red
I have some copies of there too if somebody needs one.
designates, there's there are 2 paragraphs that were removed because they talk about the alternates, right? Other than that, there's just some language changes.
Does that mean that there's 2 representatives from every one of our groups or our constituencies?
The way it's set up basically allows for up to 2 representatives. So
how does that affect, my real question is,
Yes.
how does that affect the representative groups such as ASWSU and
they
our
can
special groups?
They can fill 2 places if they want to.
Okay.
Again, if any of these, if the position isn't filled, then it's empty and isn't there. The changes aren't going to affect quorum because quorum is still defined by constituencies, not by representatives. So any more questions?
Yeah, I guess my question would be if you have certain positions that don't have an alternate,
Yes.
then the constituencies that have an alternate's vote are going to have a wider swing for the committee. So say there's myself as the alternate for WC faculty staff and the main, we essentially have double the weight versus a constituency that only has 1 vote.
Yeah.
I think that's a potential risk, but I think that given the demand to fill positions on the committee, I don't see that being something that would be too problematic, and given the fact that we typically don't have many contentious votes, but that's something that you guys can discuss if it's an issue.
Yeah.
I mean, the only thing that I see similar to that is the non-constituent members, I guess we're calling them.
Well, you
they
mean the
still-
ones that are not, that we don't choose, that
Do they
appoint their
vote?
own?
Do they vote?
Yes.
Yeah.
So if there's 5 of them or 10 of them, they could decide a lot, but not have any represented constituents that make up the quorum.
Yeah, I think you're opening yourself up to a little bit of an issue.
I'm not following what you're saying, though.
But they can vote,
Who can?
right? The non-constituent
Well, we don't-
members.
They still represent a constituency.
Yeah, we don't,
They're just selected by their own constituency rather than appointed by the committee.
I guess
They
I
count
don't
towards the
understand why
quorum.
they're not part of the quorum.
but they are.
They are. They count for whether you have a quorum or
Okay,
not.
then I misunderstood.
But so each constituency is, say, Military Hill or Pioneer Hill, right? So each constituency has 2 representatives. Quorum is defined not by the number of representatives in the room, it's defined by the number of constituencies represented by the members.
Okay.
So,
Yeah, then I just misunderstood.
okay, okay,
If you had
Yeah.
a vote then,
What's
if
that?
you had a vote that needed quorum
yes.
then both representatives of a constituency can vote.
They can vote, but they don't, so, for example, so if we have a certain number of constituencies, so we have, 6, just random number, 6 constituencies, each has, so there's 12 members, right? So, let's say 4 people show up, but they're just doubled, they only represent 2 constituencies. That's not a quorum, and they couldn't just pass something through because only 2 people are represented. But if we run the numbers up, though, it's like, basically, our quorum, okay, so if we have, 12, so, okay, 6 constituencies, 12 members. Basically, instead of saying you have to have 6 members, or, instead of saying you have to have 6 members present, you say you need 3 constituencies represented to have quorum in that slot.
Yeah, and that's,
So basically, what it means is that we don't, so it's like, that's the way quorum was set up in the past, because it means you can't, let's say, have 2 members, just a bunch of constituencies get both their members there and load it up and call quorum when it's just a few constituencies. You following?
yeah, I thought the quorum was always a certain percentage, usually always 2/3
yes.
of your constituencies. But if you're allowing the alternate to vote when the primary is also there,
Yes.
you're loading the vote for that particular constituency if another constituency doesn't have their alternate also present.
We've always, from what I understood, allowed everybody to vote, regardless.
But that's not the change you just
That's
have
always
in
been
here.
just the primary person would vote. If the primary person wasn't there, then the alternate could vote.
Okay.
That is the official guidelines. In practice, no one's keeping track of.
Yeah.
And that's
who's alternate
fine.
and
I mean,
primary,
like I
yes.
said, we've never had a close vote, but if
so
when you're putting it down on paper, you're kind of opening yourself up to somebody saying, hey,
Here's what I was going to.
swing these votes in a particular way by,
Here's what I'm going to say about that. We have a lot of constituencies. So if we said, let's each constituency have 10 members, for example, then certainly you'd have a tremendous amount of voting power at each constituency's, each constituency can produce a lot of voting power. But because we have as many as we do, 2 people, an extra person here or there, a few extra people isn't going to make much difference voting-wise. And also keep in mind, well, it's like, the main thing we vote, so we vote on chairs, we vote on
Minutes.
members, minutes. Beyond that, what do we vote on?
I can't think of a single controversial thing.
Yeah, there's nothing,
I mean,
it's not.
Sometimes.
This isn't like a legislature or something. We don't
When it
have,
does come up, that's when you have your
That's
rules.
only my thing, is I would really hesitate to open yourself up
To
to
me,
something like that.
It seems, part of the reason we looked into this is we wanted to look at the whole attendance, and then we looked into this membership part of it. So the initial priority was to help attendance, and we want folks to be participating. So whether your 1 or 2 member constituents aren't here, that's really pushing the need for that attendance factor. And so if you're not participating, you're not representing your constituent. And so that really is kind of hurting, and maybe you shouldn't be a member.
Well, and I agree with you in theory, that it could be dangerous, but another point
I mean, I don't know
that
why I'd take the risk, that would be my thing.
I think of is that a lot of constituencies have 2 members that attend very regularly. They know really what's going on, they know the history, they're very familiar with the workings. And then other constituencies, and in the last year and a half, mine, almost never has more than 1 person. And so it seems like that would kind of be unfair for somebody to show up and vote without having been participatory. But for those where there are almost always 2 people who've really committed themselves, then see, maybe they should get to vote.
Eric, can I ask a question? So the quorum will be based on constituencies and not members?
yes, that is how it's been in the past, and I didn't change that.
I'm thinking that if there's 15 constituencies and each can have 2, and you potentially have, I'm just thinking practically,
Yeah.
seating wise, if there's on members, you need 20 people here. Because I'm saying if it was on members, and you're saying it's on the constituencies,
Yes.
it gets to the point that they raised.
And let me clarify one other thing. Quorum is 50%
Of what?
constituencies.
So 15 constituencies.
So right now, we have 11 we have 11 represented constituencies. There's 4 that we have no representation at all.
So they don't
So
count.
right now, we're counting 11, which means we would need to have 6 represented constituencies to have a quorum.
Got it.
Now, if you had 12, would you need 6 or 7?
I think it's 50%. so
Okay, just
6.
flat 50, okay, yeah, yeah.
I
Yes.
generally agree, if 30 people show up for a meeting, we're in trouble.
Well, they're working on the new city hall, we're fine. We get first priority.
That's actually why
so-
they're building it.
I've been working on that. It'll be my legacy, Cory Hall.
We got 30, it'd be the end of the world, wouldn't it?
The other thing about voting is it's not like we have power to make law or something, We're not, all we can do technically is recommend something to the chief or something, like along those lines.
But we don't really hire and fire, we're not that.
I think a lot of the reason to increase the attendance too is just because we both represent the same constituency doesn't mean we're coming to the table with the same information and the same perspectives. So I feel like every one individual carries the same value regardless of their constituency because they have a different perspective. I don't just come here and say, I'm just the business community. I am not going to talk about that rooster that's really making me upset. No, I come here with everything, and I think about anytime somebody comes up to me, I try to focus on my constituency to think about, what are some ways I can put extra effort to bring the business community to the table. But I'm not going to put off to the side the other things I'm thinking about in my community in order to represent them as a whole regardless. So I think that's something to think about when we're making this decision, and just, you know, we employ, thanks to Corey Woodley, casual Roberts rules, not completely formalized, right? So but it's really up to you guys. If you guys want to think about this more, do more rewording, that's up to you guys. We can vote on it now, see what
Do we have a quorum?
we do.
You do have a quorum, yes.
But can I just bring up, not all groups are the same size. So some of us don't, I mean, we're very small. So I don't know that we'll ever be able to give you 2 people. And that's the way we've divided and conquered our work. So as our organization grows, we'd be able to have an alternative. But right now, no. This is really where we are. I imagine black men making a difference in the same boat. So something to think about.
And so how do you see that as affecting things?
Well, just from the Black Faculty Staff Association piece,
Yeah.
like, I don't know that we'll be able to have an alternate
Right.
here at the same time.
Right.
So it's always probably going to be that one vote.
Oh, right.
You know, that's just being honest. So if that
Yeah.
makes a difference, I mean, I'm 6 one way after does another, but we're probably always going to be one vote.
Yeah.
Just because of the size of our
Yeah,
organization.
so would you feel less represented knowing that you wouldn't have the second vote counted when others?
I personally don't feel threatened. I don't think we're going to decide anything in here
Well, yeah.
that is going to, you know, so I'm okay. Just as long as we get to sit at the table and say something and weigh in, I think one person and one vote is adequate.
And I think what, you know, Corey said is a good point. It's sort of like if there's people, and Adam mentioned too, it's like if there's people who are going to bother to come here, it's like, if they're going to be here, let's give them a vote. Who cares what they're from, basically? It's like, it used to be, I think there was a time when a primary and alternate would be in close communication, and the primary would be like, oh, I'm not going to be there, can you be there for me, et cetera, et cetera. Now everyone's pretty much on their own, and they show up if they can show up, if they can't, they don't, and it's sort of like, well, if they both show up, it'd be nice that they at least both be able to vote if there's something to vote on, you know, rather than being like, oh, no, you can't vote because your primary showed up today. Sort of. So that's sort of the rationale behind that, so.
Well, here's a suggestion. If we have a constituency that only has one person coming at a time, and then let's say an alternate doesn't show up, maybe that person gets 2 votes. So then in that case, every constituency will always get 2 votes, so you can either have one person and an alternate, or if one of those people doesn't show up, then that person takes that vote, so that every constituency gets 2 votes, you know, whether it's one person or 2 people.
That works for me. I think that sounds good too.
I'm 6 one way after dozen.
I mean, I think we could maybe vote on it the way it is now, and if we decide to do something like that in the future, we could add it, and maybe it won't pass now either way, but I think this has been something that we've been thinking about doing for a while.
Let me see if I got that right. You're saying one person gets 2 votes?
No.
Oh, good.
That's what you were suggesting.
No. So if every constituency gets 2 votes, right? You have a primary and an alternate. Well, let's say you don't have an alternate, or maybe one person doesn't show up. And that vote doesn't just disappear or go somewhere else, it just adds up to that constituency. So that every constituency has the exact amount of votes. And whether it's 2 people or 1 person, every little group gets the same amount of voting power. So if you decide not to show up as an alternate, then you realize that that vote is going to a person who still represents your constituency, but might have a different view than you on something else. But not every person gets 2 votes. Every constituency gets 2 votes. And
Well,
it
but-
can be 2 people or 1 person.
How do you handle a situation where one person doesn't show up?
Then the other person realizes, or he knows who the other person is, and then he's like, okay, that person's not here, then I have 2 votes.
Like if a full constituency doesn't show up, is that what you're asking? Like.
Yeah, so if only one person shows up,
She gets 2 votes.
No.
so if the
I'll vote no right away.
if the primary shows up and the alternate has a different view, the primary gets to carry the alternate.
Then alternate should have shown up to express his view. But if he chose not to show up, that means he has something else going on, and that means he's forbidding his view.
Somehow that doesn't sound American. I don't know. But I was born in Canada, so don't ask me.
How about I propose that if we want to do something like that, because we notice, you know, that certain constituencies aren't getting represented in votes, especially if we're seeing close ties, that we address this. This is a working document that can be changed at any time. And we're a really flexible, dynamic group. I think we're easy to work with each other. So I think for now, I think this would increase attendance. So I do hope that we vote on this just so that it increases incentivizing people to come to the meeting. But it's really up to you guys.
So you're getting rid of alternates?
Well,
Everybody's full
basically
member.
everyone's a full member,
Yes.
yes.
Yeah, I think that's
And
a great
everyone
idea.
has one vote.
Well, as far as I know, this is still America. Yes. No, I've never heard of someone getting more than one vote. I don't know what part of government. Do they do that at the city council?
Here's the thing, if you want to do that, it'd be better to allow voting, absentee voting, yes. If you want to do that, you gotta do it.
You got rid of
We
it.
are not
Allowing
doing absentee
absentee.
voting.
You got rid of it.
Well, at this point, that's not allowed. I'm just saying, if you want to do something like he's suggesting, it's got to be through absentee voting,
Yeah, that's
I
a
think.
pain in the neck.
Yeah.
Yeah, we're not doing that.
Okay, but we don't have that,
She's
so it
already
can't
got
be
enough on
done.
her
No,
plate, so-
that's, right now, that's not allowed, so.
Good. I'm all in favor of that.
Okay.
But if all we're voting on is minutes and if we're gonna have a new person in and stuff, do you really think that's gonna increase somebody's desire to wanna come? Like, I don't know if I'm an alternate, so I'm just saying I don't not come because I'm not gonna get to vote on whether or not we approve the minutes or not.
It basically.
Sorry, I'm not.
Some
Like,
people have brought, some alternates have brought that up. Just saying.
It just brings us so that we're all under the same attendance policy, basically. So.
Well, that's the other thing,
Yeah.
Our attendance policy applies only to primary members. Basically, alternates are a free ride, they don't have to show up at all.
Is that changed on here? 'Cause I didn't-
Let's
Because everybody
see what
is
we have here.
primary members now, basically, then they're automatically under that attendance policy.
So just so I'm
that's
clear,
his thing.
what
Yes.
constituencies are here tonight? Can you just list them off?
WSU faculty staff, College Hill, Pioneer Hill, Military Hill, Sunnyside Hill, business community, multicultural. Actually, they're not here.
Did we miss any?
GPSA,
Yeah,
WSU Black Faculty and Staff Association.
We got 9 out of 11, well done.
10, right?
I counted 9. You got, who's the one you're missing?
No, she's not here. We don't have this one.
Oh, I'm sorry, yeah, you're right. I'm sorry, Greg.
No, but 9 out of 11, well done, team.
So,
Well, I should probably just say that I make a motion to approve these as presented.
Second.
all in favor?
aye.
Any opposed?
Nay.
One opposed, so. It passes.
I think one person, one vote. If you're voting for president in 2020, if you vote in Wyoming, your vote is worth 1,222 in California.
That's right.
That's outrageous.
Well, that's beyond the scope of this committee.
Yes, thank you,
That's
Chieftain.
why we're in such big trouble.
So, speaking of
point,
changes
Richard.
here, so we're gonna have we are going to elect a vice chair. Stephanie is moving into the chair position. I am moving out of this role. I'm really sad to leave you guys. I really hope that I end up back and able to do this again in the future, because it's been a great honor of mine to be with this committee. And I would like to start off with, I would like to nominate Eric as vice chair. I feel like he's stepped up his leadership skills. He's always there for us. He's always putting forth extra effort when it comes to lentil festivals and any other things that we have to do, including spending time doing these guideline updates and things like that. He's always been a great second-hand man, and I think he'd be a great first-hand man too. So I would like to nominate him, but I do also, we would take any other nominations for a vice chair position as well. You're also welcome to volunteer yourself.
Sounds quiet, let's move on.
All right, so I guess I didn't need a.
Yeah.
Are you okay with this, Eric?
Yes.
I need to verify
good
that.
with
That's a good question. Does he want to do it?
Motion before debate.
How long's the
so,
term
yeah.
for?
Well, and technically until, not this upcoming September, but the September after.
But when did our last election was?
September.
Last September.
Previously.
Yeah.
So it's 3 years from last September, right?
Yes, and September was our last, this last September was our last election.
Yeah.
3 years, but there is no limit on how many consecutive years.
But every 3 years, there's an election
But
in
you-
September.
We can always
Yes.
rebel and kick them out if we
Yeah.
So do I hear do I need a motion?
I move that we elect Eric as our vice chair.
Second?
Second.
All in favor?
Aye.
Any opposed? Okay. Congratulations and welcome to the vice chair position. Very excited about that. So I'm going to pass it on to Chief Jenkins for a police department update if we have time. Yes, we do have
All right, we do have time. All right, so just update you on our personnel staffing. We still have our 3 officers in the academy that will graduate in June. I hired, and they bring us up to 29. I hired Rick Gannett and Kayla Nuxall. They will start the academy in August, and they will graduate December 13th. That brings us to 30 and 31. I hired a lateral police officer, Garrett Willis, from Lewiston Police Department. He will start the end of May, so he makes 32. And that completed the previous hiring list that we had. And we did some recent testing, so we have a brand-new list to work off of, and we currently are doing a background on somebody from that list right now, and so that position would bring us up to our full staffing of 33.
Wow.
Code enforcement officers, council did increase from 3 to 4, so we are still working on a background on a person to fill that 4th position. Record specialist, we are continuing to do a background on someone to replace Ari Pons, who moved to code enforcement. Record specialist Katie Nelson has given her notice to leave June 22nd. She's going to be going to law school. So we have a good list for record specialists, so we are starting a background on another person for record specialist. I don't have an update on the pipe bomb call that we had 2 weekends ago. We sent the evidence to the crime lab to see if there's anything to work off of. We've already talked to the FBI and the ATF. We've also compared notes with Moscow PD because they had a similar incident, but it was not a similar device.
Am I correct on that? Was it the 3 pipe bombs and?
There's only been 2 explosive devices. The rest of
One in Moscow and one in Pullman, and one was a dud. There were 3?
the others, none of the others were explosive devices.
Well, how many were there total?
2. One in Moscow, one in Pullman.
Okay. And they were both explosive?
Yes. So we're continuing to investigate that. And so the last thing I want to do is recognize Corey for all the time that she has spent as chair of the committee. It's been a lot of work, and she's done a really good job. I think one of the biggest benefits that I've seen from Corey's leadership is bringing in at just about every meeting someone to speak, like Dr. Makin and Dr. Willits today, but to help not only inform the committee, but also, through our posting on YouTube, that information is there for anybody to watch at any time and can educate the public. And so I think that's been extremely beneficial. So we have a plaque for
Oh,
Corey.
beautiful.
Corey Woodley and recognize her outstanding leadership and contributions to the Pullman Police Advisory Committee.
Wow.
May I ask a question? Congratulations with your mission. I was going in for a short period of time, so.
Thank you.
Will we see you again in a different capacity?
I hope so, yes.
I have a question for you though, Chief Jenkins. Based on what has been going on with the, I feel like these postings, has there been any, let me back it up, has there been a rehearsed effort between the Pullman Police Department and WSU Police Department and community to do an active shooter exercise from kind of cradle to grave so that we can do some simulation and kind of look at holes and gaps?
We have done a few.
Okay.
We haven't done one jointly with WSU PD. We've done a few active shooter drills over the past few years. Most recently, we did, actually, when people ask for training on that, we take an opportunity to do a drill with our people at the same time. So we did one at the library a number of months ago for their staff, and then we used our staff to kind of do a drill as far as a response. We did the same thing for city employees, and then previously we've done it with Pullman Regional Hospital with their the services that they have down the street from the hospital at those buildings.
Well, the reason I ask is whenever we try to do some kind of research or practice or make a concerted plan, every facility is different. So if you have a facility that's full of glass, that may not work as well as a classroom. The other thing is we bring an extraordinary amount of visitors on our campus. And so they're not going to know where Todd Hall is or the north side of campus is, or they're just not going to have that kind of awareness. And then if you're a new freshman on campus, you yourself may not have that awareness. So just kind of, I need some help looking at the vocabulary and language, like when the text comes out, what does that text look like? If there's somebody responding, how do we communicate what door to let people egress out of? If there's two, how do we respond if there's two shooters and we don't let one, all those questions could help us really save lives.
So I know that WSU does go and do active shooter presentations for different groups around campus.
Okay.
So that'd be one place to start, but we could also bring someone here just to give an overview of law enforcement response to active shooters.
So
That's a really good idea.
Every building on campus is supposed to have a safety committee, and then your safety committee is supposed to be responsible for disseminating that information within the building, because each building is so different, like you said, glass or labs. I mean, we have buildings on campus that have explosive materials in them and radioactive materials and things like that. So it's building by building specific. And some buildings are great about it, and some buildings are not great about it. So I would voice that concern within your building, like, hey, I don't know which door to go out of.
Well, the challenge for us, we have student employees, so I hire almost 60% new every year. They don't even know what a spoodle is, let alone closest egress,
Yeah.
And it's the same with the residence halls. Like, they're new too, they're new to Regents. So they're not gonna know where the closest egress. So trying to convey that in the heat of the moment is going to be weird, but then even trying to convey it without some kind of theoretical framework, know your closest egress is, like, even that kind of sounds a little weird. So just having that conjoined effort to work with residents' life and do a rehearsal on the building.
Yeah, because we've done them in Todd Hall. So it's our safety committee has reached out to WSU Police and said, we want an active shooter demonstration, we want a fire drill, we want a whatever, but it's building by building specific.
Yeah, and they will do that for you.
Yeah.
And that's kind of what we do for our city agencies as well.
Yeah.
But that would be a good topic for our committee as well.
Because I'm in an all-glass office. It's really fantastic.
Officer Curtis Whitman at the University Police, he also goes around to all the graduate student, well, not all of them, a lot of the SOE graduate student classes and talks about that. I think that he'd be a good contact for that kind of training as well. So.
Yeah, even the IED training, like, what does that look like? How do you identify one? How do you get people to not touch it or not investigate it, to get a certain far amount of distance and call, to, cordon it off? Like, how do you walk people through those kinds of behaviors?
Yeah.
So.
Yep, all really good questions.
There was a story in the Daily News or the Lewiston Trib, I get both, and I forget which it was in, police department understaffing in Moscow and Pullman. It sounds like we're catching up a bit, but if I'm interpreting the information right, and I don't mean this as a criticism, I mean it as a compliment, the community of Pullman pays much better for its police officers than does Moscow.
Well, there's definitely a difference between pay in Idaho and Washington. I think that's probably the biggest difference we see, not just in government, but in businesses as well, with minimum wages and that type of a thing. So it definitely makes it easier for us to attract candidates than it does for...
So I interpreted that correct. There is a big difference.
There is, yes. But I'll also say that we're not getting applicants from Latah County Sheriff's or Moscow PD applying to come to Pullman either. I think they're happy where they are. So it's not the only consideration, but it probably is a consideration for someone looking for a new job.
I'd frankly want to be paid pretty well if I was a cop.
Well, that we can agree on.
Quick question, the Lewiston, you said lateral from Lewiston hire. Does that person not have to go through the state?
The academy?
Academy.
So the way it works is Washington recognizes law enforcement basic training from specific states.
Okay.
And they do recognize Idaho. So what happens is they go to a 2-week, what's called an equivalency academy.
Okay.
So it teaches them the laws of Washington and search case law in Washington, those types of things. So we can get him started in our field training program, and there's a equivalency academy actually in Spokane a couple of months after he's here. So while he's in training with us, then he goes to that and comes back and finishes training. So it'll work out really well.
Okay, great.
And then I did the same thing when I came from California. I had to go to an equivalency academy as well.
I have one last question. So on you printed the, I printed out the weekly recap from April 25th to May 1st, and it has in there 2 frauds. One with a 27-year-old male paid $4,000 worth of Google gift cards to avoid an arrest warrant from Social Security, and you have another one. Are you able to share what that means? Because when I read this, I was a little like, what?
So these people are getting calls from someone identifying themselves from different organizations. Sometimes it's the IRS, and they say, you need to pay this much right away or we're going to send somebody to arrest you. So this is how we're going to take payment. Go down to your store and buy iTunes cards and provide the information to me, and everything's good, we will come and arrest you. So I don't know if you've seen, some of the stores still have them up, but at one point we went around to all the stores in Pullman. The last place I saw it was at Rite Aid, but we have something pasted there at the register that says, basically warning, if you're making a payment using iTunes cards or any kind of a gift card, then there's a possibility that there's a fraud, and call Pullman Police and verify it, before you go through with it. So, yeah, that's something that we continually see. And we do a lot of public information on it with our social media to try to warn people when we see it. It resurfaces every once in a while.
And we've had like people who have spent large quantities of money on Google cards and stuff to give. Yeah, it's been a real thing that's happening.
So let me ask in relation to that. Would you ever have a true law enforcement agency call you and say, do something or you're going to be arrested?
Well,
they wouldn't say, pay me and get
they wouldn't say, you need to make this payment to me right now.
Okay.
I mean, there are times that somebody might have a warrant for their arrest, and so they would say, you need to come to the court and resolve this, but they won't say, give me some payment information over the phone. They won't take the payment information over the phone.
Okay.
That's good.
Chief Jenkins, is there, I know you used to have the signs like a Safeway, like you'd have it right there where all the gift cards were, just a little warning. Is there any concerted effort to talk to managers, supervisors at those locations to let
That's
them-
something that we probably need to do regularly, because they see turnover with their employees like we do with students at WSU, so it's a regular
Yeah, and
ongoing.
there's one thing if someone's buying like 5 cards, no big deal, right? But when you're talking about $3,000 or $4,000,
Yeah.
people are not buying those cards from the store. I mean, and we know that. So what we're talking about is that it's that selection bias, because you're getting people to opt in who are going to like these are the people who are already going to be talked into sending money to the Nigerian prince. They've opted in, and that's what allows them to be exploited as much as they are. And they don't get that money back.
Yeah, we actually do get calls occasionally from stores or a bank that will
Yeah.
say something's going on here and we can intervene, but no, that's something that we probably need to make sure we do more regularly.
Can you imagine a cashier says, hey, this person just bought like 6 of these cards. Here, like, that's the type of information that can be transferred to law enforcement that is low risk, but could absolutely prevent something like where you're out $4,000.
And it's a hard thing to keep up on, because I mean, I don't know how many employees like Walmart, for example, goes through and how their turnover rate's like, but it's just a kind of hard thing to keep up on.
David, do you want to start us with the constituency poll?
So I have nothing to report.
I don't either.
Okay,
Me neither.
great.
No.
Okay. Nope. Okay.
I do not.
Me either.
Wow, this is really going fast today. All I have is just to thank you all and thank Darby and Gary so much for your support and allowing me to be a part of this great committee, and I really hope that I can see you guys all again in the future.
Oh, and one thing I forgot on my update was we did talk the rooster into moving.
Oh, what she did? Is that what they were
Really? It
grilling?
had been quiet.
Were they grilling the rooster? Did you shoot the rooster?
Actually, planning department contacted them and said, you're not zoned for a rooster. What?
I noticed they were having a big barbecue when I now I kind of feel bad being a vegetarian and all. Well, oh well. Thank you.
This reminds me of my good friend Dave Stratton, and you dealt with his son's death and so on. He was a University of Colorado PhD, a big Colorado football fan, and they have the buffalo that they run out with.
Yeah.
And I forget his name, but back when Dave was there, the buffalo went wild. They barbecued him.
Wow.
Well, I'm pretty sure that the rooster's been barbecued.
Okay, nothing.
And College Hill is very quiet.
Another couple of months.
Well, I don't think we need a motion to adjourn at this point. We're almost out of time, so, yeah.
All right.
Okay.
Well,
Thanks,
thank you so
everybody, for
much.
coming.
Thank you.